and welcome to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason Mann. With me, as usual, is Rich Critch. Hello, Rich.
Hey, how's it going?
Doing good. We've, we've got some interesting topic today. It's always an interesting topic at the Over and Back at Classic NBA podcast, of course. We are talking about players that really were among the most elite of elite when they were in the 20, 21, 22 range, and where they went from there. And later on, we're going to talk about some players who were among the worst in those range and where they went from there. And there's some guys in both categories that are playing right now. But it's interesting because, in terms of and we use box score plus minus, kind of the easiest metric to compare these guys. A lot of these guys, in fact, almost all of them, well, most of them, like 90% of them or so, ended up with, either Hall of Fame careers or a career that would have been Hall of Fame if something, like an injury happened or something like that.
Right, yeah. A lot of the guys we're going to mention here, and we'll quickly gloss over, the all-time grades, because, you don't really need us to explain to you that LeBron James is good or whatever. Shaquille O'Neal was a solid player, but we'll dig deep into some of the guys that didn't quite get there and the reasons why they didn't quite get there. But there are some names on here, and there's particularly one or two guys that pop up, as very young players that are elite level, and you'll see that with so many hits, it's amazing that there's any misses, including a few of these guys who, these guys aren't terrible players on any stretch. They still had great careers, but they definitely fall short of the lofty expectations that having this sort of, and your criteria here was 5.5 box score plus minus or above when you're 22 and younger, and you'll see that a majority of these guys are all-time greats, and then there's some that just didn't quite get there, and it's really interesting to see how they, where their paths were diverted away from that.
Yeah, so the guys who, are either, definite superstars, either Hall of Famers or will be Hall of Famers, Charles Barkley, Anthony Davis, I think likely on that track, obviously still young in his career. Kevin Garnett, LeBron James was on this 3 times. Magic Johnson was on it 3 times. Michael Jordan, Kawhi Leonard, Tracy McGrady was on it twice. Shaquille O'Neal, Chris Paul, Bill Walton, and then Derrick Rose, who, if not for the injury, I think would have been on that Hall of Fame track as well. So all these guys, at 22 or younger, were on this elite list of, in this box score plus minus list. Now, box score plus minus, as we mentioned before, only goes back to 74. So we're not comparing. I'm sure. Though most of the guys were not in the league before 22, so there probably aren't necessarily a lot of guys that would have been on this list before. Kareem probably, even though he might have been 22 by the time he was in the league. So I guess most of those guys wouldn't have had a chance to be in the league anyway. Right. So I guess it's a pretty fair comparison if you think about it in those terms. But the guys who are having it this season. Nikola Jokic and Giannis Antetokounmpo are both having 8+ box score plus minus seasons when we're as we're recording this, and for guys who are under 22, they're the 6th and 9th best seasons in that category of all time. So it's putting them obviously on a track in which it looks like, wow, they're going to really be impressive players. Every guy on this list, with the exception of the guys we're going to talk about, are, surefire, awesome, just, had incredible careers. But there's a handful of guys who just didn't quite work out for it. It's kind of interesting to explore the reasons why.
Yeah, and one other guy as well, you want to mention, Rudy Gobert in 2015 was on this list as well.
Right.
And we have no idea where his path's going to go. He's kind of putting together a very good season this year again, and he's starting, obviously the Jazz are starting to get a little bit better. So you can see a path where Rudy Gobert stays great, but it's still too early to tell. In another 5 years, we'll have a better idea of what the Rudy Gobert, path is going to be. But at this point, who knows? He blows out his knee, tomorrow. It's a completely different trajectory than if he stays healthy for the next 5-6 years. So you have no idea with him, but he's another guy to mention and kind of keep an eye out for as well.
Yeah, and he's not a guy who I would necessarily think he's going to be in the superstar level, of the guys that we talked about. Now he's, he may be, more like a Mutombo type where he's just, the defensive specialist and does enough on offense, or like a, Tyson Chandler, who's probably not quite a Hall of Famer, but, a guy at that level, you definitely could see that, whether it'll be more than that, I guess depends on the defensive value that he provides and longevity and all that kind of thing. But good point. Thank you for bringing him up. I'd forgotten to overlook him in this list, but he is important. The guy who we're going to talk about first is Alvan Adams, who was on this list twice in the 76 and 77 seasons. He played his entire career for the Phoenix Suns, 12 seasons. He helped lead the Suns to the NBA Finals, this very surprise team in 76. They went only 42 and 40 during the regular season. He led the team both in PER and box score plus minus. It was 6.7, and which is exceptional. Also, that year, 19 points per game, 9.1 rebounds per game, 5.6 assists per game, and only three other centers in NBA history, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, and Sam Lacey of the Kansas City Kings in the same era, have had more assists per game in a season. And his season is actually number 3 in assist percentage for a center in NBA history of all time, Tom Boerwinkle and Vlade Divac. However, this season, Nikola Jokic and DeMarcus Cousins are actually slightly ahead of him. At this point in the season, we'll see where they end up at the end of the season. But he's, an exceptional passer, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make there.
Yeah, and Jokic, you can see. Actually, a pretty interesting comp there, because Jokic is a guy who now with Nurkic not on the Nuggets, you can see him maybe increasing that total as well. I mean, Jokic, I recently saw the Denver live, and I've been watching their games a lot recently because it's a pretty fun team to watch. And he controls the ball. I mean, he's like, the ball goes through his hands. Very similar to how Vlade was at certain points during those, the peak Sacramento years. So it'll be interesting to see where Jokic goes with that. And Cousins as well, moving over to New Orleans, might have the ball in his hands more for a passing than necessarily scoring all the time. So it'll be interesting to see kind of the follow of those two guys. And that was Alvin Adams' rookie year, correct?
Yes, it was.
Okay, so that's quite the way to start your career there. With come out of nowhere, have one of the best seasons of all time, and you surprise the world by getting your leading your team to the NBA Finals. So I mean, full steam ahead for Alvan Adams, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and he had a very good career. He really did. I mean, he, the Suns teams in the late 70s and early 80s were generally very good, but they fell short, kind of to the Sonics and then later to the Lakers. And, with Westfield, they were a very good team, but, didn't make the finals again, obviously. And that was his best season. I mean, he had his next few seasons. I mean, 77 was great as well. Just a bit below those numbers. And kind of, carried this, I don't want to use the word burden exactly, but he was famous for being kind of one of these guys, and there's a handful of these guys in NBA history. You look at like Tyreek Evans and Walt Bellamy, of guys whose most productive season was their rookie season, never seemed to build on that, at least not production wise. And when he retired, he would say, "I never felt that rookie season was an albatross that I carried around my whole career. But I remember thinking there very likely will never be anything like this again with this much excitement." So it was something that he obviously thought about and felt about. But in that finals against the Celtics, that's of course the famous Game 5-3 overtime game with all the great heroics going on there. He battled against Dave Cowens during that finals and really matched up with him pretty well. They both were undersized big men who were good at hustling and getting rebounds. And he led the Suns in scoring, rebounding. It was a close second in assists during that finals. So. Yeah, it really did show an ability to be able to battle with bigger players throughout his career, and kind of counteracting them with having the mid-range shooting, and obviously his ability to pass and direct the offense from the top of the key.
Absolutely.
So next is, of course, a guy who I talked about a bit in a recent episode about the history of the Clippers.
Yeah, it's Elton Brand. 2002, he jumps on this list. 6.2 box plus minus, 18.2 points per game, and 11.6 rebounds per game. This is age 22 season. 2002, his third year in the league. But he has got a really interesting path as well. And kind of do a little bit of background first before we kind of get into where his career went. But he's only a two-time All-Star, 2002, the aforementioned year, and then 2006. Believe it or not, he was the only Clippers All-Star between 1995 and 2009, which I said believe it or not, but it's pretty easy to believe when you look at the rosters of those those teams. So I take back my believe it or not and say very obviously he is the only Clippers All-Star between 95 and 2009. One-time All-NBA second team. Kind of an undersized center, power forward, hybrid guy, a guy that, in today's league might not fly nearly as much because he was very much a back-to-the-basket guy, a guy that kind of controlled the ball down low, had a lot of nifty moves. As his career sort of moved on, he got a little bit better at jump shooting and a little bit better at kind of stretching out his range. But when he first came into the league, he was sort of a bruiser type, but never really had the big size to do it, which is always interesting about him. He was, listed, I think, 6'8", 6'9", depending on what team he was on or how they were kind of branding their season. He could always be a little bit taller. I know when he first came to the Bulls, they said he was taller, and then little by little he started, shrinking every year. But it was kind of interesting. He was just sort of a hybrid power forward center combo. In his career, though, 3.1 box plus minus, 20.5 PR, 15.9 points per game, 8.5 rebounds per game, and 2.1 assists per game. Though, what's really interesting about him, and we'll get to it here in a little bit of kind of breaking down his career, is from 2000 to 2007, which is really his arguable peak, his 8-year peak, 4.5 box plus minus, 22.7 PR, 20.3 points per game, and 10.2 rebounds per game. And I actually looked at that a little bit as well, and it's really interesting. I mean, just on a purely like kind of the box score stuff, the 20 points per game, 10 plus rebounds per game, and 2 plus blocks per game. There's only 6 players in NBA history that average that through their entire career. Obviously, we're cutting off the back end of Elton Brand's career, but through the first 8 years of his career, I mean, this was an all-time great. I mean, those guys that have averages of that is Alvin Hayes, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, Shaq, and then Anthony Davis still has that right now, that 20-plus point per game, 10-plus rebound per game, and 2-plus blocks per game. So through the first 8 or 7 or 8 seasons of Elton Brand, you're looking at an all-time great player. And then, of course, some other things kind of got in there. But, circling back to sort of his rookie career, or his rookie year, rather, he was one of 20 players all-time to average 20-plus points per game and 10-plus rebounds per game in his rookie season. And you look at the list of that guy, people that have done that, it's the best of the best. I mean, only one player has done it since Brand did it in 1999, and that's Blake Griffin in 2010. And then you look at other more recent rookies to do it, and it's a who's who. It's Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, Shaq, Alonzo Mourning, and Tim Duncan are the only kind of recent guys. And I use recent sort of in quotes because I'm adding Hakeem Olajuwon in there, which shows you how far back it is and how rare it is for a rookie to average 20 and 10. And Brand did that. Of course, after 2 seasons in Chicago, he was traded to the Clippers for Tyson Chandler and Brian Skinner. Brian Skinner was then traded a month later to the Raptors for Charles Oakley. So the Bulls were in this rebuild of a rebuild. They had rebuilt after Jordan and Scotty and Phil and all those guys had left. Got Brand, and then after 2 years decided, no, we're going to go in a different direction, and got the Tyson Chandler, Eddie Curry thing going together. It didn't really work quite as well right off the bat, but it was interesting play, though, by Jerry Krause and the Bulls management to sort of understand maybe they weren't going to get to the level they wanted with Brand, so to kind of move on from him. So, of course, Brand goes to the Clippers then, and then becomes the first Clipper in 2002 since Danny Manning in 1994 to be selected to the All-Star team. Some interesting stuff with Elton Brand throughout his Clippers career. He was a restricted free agent in 2003. I forgot that this happened. And Miami Heat made an offer for $82 million over 6 years. In what was an unprecedented move at the time by Donald Sterling, the Clippers matched that offer, though, and Brand stayed a Clipper. Just to let you know how unprecedented that, prior to that, the biggest contract Sterling had ever approved was a 5-year, $15 million deal to Eric Piatkowski in 1998. So, not big bucks going out there. And I always found that funny, too, because, 2003 going to the Heat probably don't get Dwayne Wade then, right? I mean, you can kind of understand you add, Elton Brand to a team with, Caron Butler and a few other guys. They probably do okay. Maybe they get out of the lottery and don't draft, Wade. It's just interesting to see that sort of alternative history if Elton Brand becomes Miami Heat player. 2006, Brand and the Clippers emerged as one of the Western Conference top teams. They win 47 games and make it to Game 7 of the Western Conference Finals. This was actually...
Semifinals.
Semifinals, yes, yeah. And then the first playoff series, this is actually their first playoff series win. So them winning in the first round of the Western Conference was their first playoff series win as a franchise since 1976. And of course, in 1996, they were still the Buffalo Braves. So that tells you the the Clippers history. And you went into very great detail about that in a podcast last week on this very channel. So other stuff about Brand, he made a career best season that year, 24.7 points per game, 10 rebounds per game. Made a second All-Star game, and he finished 7th that year in MVP voting. So looked like he had something good going here with the Clippers. He had something good with Brand. He seemed to have kind of merged, got everything together. And then he missed most of the 2007-2008 season with a ruptured Achilles. Then things got a little weird for him in the Clippers. He opted out of the final year of his contract and became a free agent. A little bit of trickery here because Brandon, his agent David Falk, who's a very famous NBA agent and player agent, he announced that Brand was opting out of his contract, and that was to give the Clippers some more payroll flexibility so that they could strengthen the team around Brand. Almost immediately after he opted out, the Clippers went and grabbed Baron Davis, who was coming off a really great season with the Golden State Warriors, with the idea that they were going to build between Baron Davis and Elton Brand. And then Brand signed with the Philadelphia 76ers for a 5-year, $82 million contract. And so the Clippers were spurned. And then things didn't go very well for Brand in Philly. Over a 4-year tenure, he was routinely injured and failed to really score more than 15 points per game in a season. He was released prior to the 2012-2013 season via the new amnesty clause. Then he, of course, at the end of his career, moved on to the Mavericks, the Hawks, and then once again Philly before calling it quits after the 2015-2016 season. As far as Elton Brand and the experience of Elton Brand and what he was, I mean, as I said, first 7 or 8 years, really great player. Achilles injury, he never quite got it back. Was still a serviceable player, but just little by little, I know he had some shoulder injuries later in his career. The body just broke down eventually, and that's really where you look at the Brand trajectory. I mean, because 8 years, he's right there on that trajectory, and then the last little chunk, it's not quite there. But it's an interesting question of, you know, how much do we value those first 8 years of Elton Brand? Because they're really, really great years.
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting because I would have thought that he was good enough to be a borderline Hall of Famer, and that peak was very, very good, but I would say it was great, but it was below superstar level probably. I mean, probably 06 is the kind of the year where you could say, okay, that's like definitely like superstar, like possibly best best player on a finals team type superstar level. So I don't know. I mean, I think there's a case for there. I think pre this era of Blake Griffin, Chris Paul, he's the best Clipper ever. I don't know what that means, but I think it's there's something to that. I mean, if he went in the Hall of Fame, I would think it'd be totally fine. But he probably just doesn't quite have enough of the the All NBA appearances or that that longevity wasn't quite there. I mean, he had 8 really good seasons and he was definitely a standout. But there's dozens of other players who have had probably a similar stretch to that in their career. So it probably just isn't quite enough. I mean, if he had been able to kind of settle into like a more, effective backup role in, Philly and later on, instead of being kind of a guy who struggled to hold on for a while. I mean, he had some okay years, but it was definitely, it definitely wasn't close to the same. He wasn't like part of like, if he'd been on a couple of championship teams there toward the end or something like that, if he'd been like the, guy coming off the bench or whatever, like a guy like Michael Thompson we talked about with the Lakers, sort of kind of toward the end, something like that. I think if he had been able to kind of be in that situation, then maybe, but probably not with what he did. I forgot to mention with Alvan Adams, which I think is illuminates what kind of career that he had before we move on to the next guy. But his career box score plus minus was 3.7. which is 39th all time. And again, going back to only 74, but you're in the top 40 in that stat. that's interesting. Like I said, no number is perfect. Box score plus minus has its issues, but as far as the kind of the one number stats go, it's probably the best that Basketball Reference has to offer. In most circumstances.
Yeah, and getting back to Brand, then we'll kind of move on to our other guy too. I mean, Adams,
sure.
that's a good one. Brand, he's in the top 60s at 59th in career box plus minus. But what's also interesting, and you pointed out, and that's kind of the argument I would make against Brand as well, is that he just doesn't appear on those All NBA teams, and it's largely because he's playing, in the same conference as a Tim Duncan, playing in the same league as a Shaq, playing in the same league as a Kevin Garnett. I mean, among power forward centers, big men of his era, he just doesn't stand out all that much over those guys who were just elite, all-time great players. So maybe that's partially plays, part in what we sort of think of Brand and how he's historically, regarded, is that he wasn't leaps and bounds better than his contemporaries at any point. I mean, he had 1 or 2 years where he really stood out and maybe ran with them, but never at any point was like, oh my God, Elton Brand is one of the best big men in this league right now. He just never quite got to that level.
Mm-hmm. So next we have John Drew, who played in the late 70s and into the mid 80s with the Hawks and with the Utah Jazz. And his second season in 1976, he had 6.2 blocks per plus minus, 21.6 points per game, 8.6 rebounds per game, and a 25.3 PER. And for his career, numbers are really very good. 1.2 blocks plus minus, which is still okay. But 20.7 points per game, 6.9 rebounds per game, 20.7 PER, was known for his excellent ball handling, scoring, getting to the free throw line, was a great small forward. And those years that he had with the Hawks, they had some very good seasons in the late 70s with Drew as their star, under Hubie Brown. They also had Dan Roundfield, Fast Eddie Johnson, and Tree Rollins. And unfortunately, he became a cautionary tale later in his career as he went into rehab for cocaine addiction. 1983, that was public. He had some there's articles later showing that he had some previous stints that the Hawks sent him to, and was also infamously part of the trade that sent Dominique Wilkins, who was drafted by the Jazz, to the Hawks. So he was on the bad end of one of the most one-sided trades in NBA history because he played three seasons in Utah where he dealt with drugs and was unable to contribute. But when he was playing, he was an excellent player, particularly in those first 3 or 4 years. And there's a good New York Times article from 1983 as he's dealing with cocaine addiction and talking about kind of detailing the where kind of the downfall began, unfortunately. But for a while he was a great player, and even as he dealt with drug issues into the early 80s, he was still productive for a long time before he really began to slip.
Yeah. It's a unfortunate tale of him, and of course there are many other players of that era too, where it's just you look at their careers and where they were possibly going and just derailed completely by drugs and other issues as well. But it's definitely a sad cautionary tale for him though.
Yeah, he shares the NBA record with Jason Kidd for most turnovers in a game with 14. As an obviously not a positive stat, but notable. He was a 2-time All-Star, and after he went into rehab in 83, he came back in 84, was actually the comeback player of the year back when they still had that, before it went to drug guys people who got in trouble for drugs and then came back and then relapsed, which he did in 1985. Unfortunately, he was the first NBA player to be banned for life because of drugs in 86. And then in 1987, he was arrested for selling drugs to an undercover agent. As late as 2010, he was a cab driver in Houston, and there's a profile of him for Alabama newspaper, and his high school coach said, this was in 2010, "I believe he would have gone farther than Charles Barkley. John Drew had the capabilities of being a player like Magic Johnson and Kobe Bryant. He had that kind of talent. It just wasn't no telling how far he could have gone." So he played in high school in Alabama. He's one of the of course sort of forgotten because of his struggles later, but was one of the great players to come out of the state during that time. And it's a nice profile. Talks about how this is also of course during the time in which schools are being integrated, and he played for an integrated school, and it was a way of sort of bringing fans together in that situation, and someone who black and white fans were cheering for during that time. So
absolutely. Next guy on our list, Andrei Kirilenko. He's on this list twice actually. 2003. In 2004, 2003, he had a 6.6 box score plus minus, 12 points per game, 5.3 rebounds per game, 1.5 steals per game, and 2.2 blocks per game. Of course, it's a prime Andrei Kirilenko stat line there with just a little bit of everything. 2004, he follows it up with an even better season, 8.2 box plus minus, 16.5 points per game, 8.1 rebounds per game, 3.1 assists per game, 1.9 steals per game, and 2.8 blocks per game. And now I'll get my breath because damn you, Andre. Stop getting so many stats. Yeah.
I'll interject with that 8.2 blocks per plus minus right now is 8th all time, depending on where Jokic and Giannis finish this season. So
it's just like Andrei Kirilenko, one of the 10 best seasons of all time. It's just like it's hard to imagine, but I mean Andre was there for a while. Hybrid small forward, power forward, could do really anything on the court, and those stat lines are people that didn't watch him play. I mean, this was a guy who just he could score pretty smoothly. He could get great rebounds. He was a great passer. He was good at stealing, good at blocks, great at defense. And that props up his box score plus minus as well, as he was just a great defensive player and a positive offensive player during the first part of his career too. And we're talking about a super young dude. It's just crazy. Made the All-Star game one time in 2004 with that remarkable season. Career all time, 5.0 box score plus minus. That's 20th all time. Andrei Kirilenko, 11.8 points per game, 5.5 rebounds per game, and 2.7 assists per game. We'll get to a little bit of why those numbers are a little bit lower than you would sort of imagine with a guy who started his career that way. But interesting way to kind of begin his career. He's drafted in 1999, and at that time, he's 18 years and 132 days, and he was the youngest European player at the time to be drafted when the Utah Jazz selected him with the 24th pick in that draft. He was also the first Russian to be picked in the first round of the NBA draft that year. He finally joined the Jazz a few years later, 2001. It was basically, as you mentioned, 2003, 2004 is when he kind of got going. In that season, he ranked third in the league in block shots per game, and fourth in the league in steals per game. He became just the second player in NBA history to rank top 5 in both categories. David Robinson, the 91-92 season, was the other one to do that. More than that, though, AK-47, the greatest nickname in basketball history. I don't know about greatest, but to me it's top 5.
It's a good one, yeah.
It's in the Mount Rushmore of NBA nicknames for me. But AK-47, because his number was 47, it was just so perfect. I loved it. When I finally realized, I was like, that is just, oh my god, that's all crazy. Okay. Anyway, he assumed leadership duties, importantly after the Jazz, after the kind of the post Malone Stockton era of the Jazz. It was kind of Kirilenko's team in a lot of ways. The problem was the team wasn't great like that. It didn't quite work that way. He was one of the most versatile players in the league, though. I mean, him and Hakeem Olajuwon are the only two players to have finished a game with at least 6 steals, 6 blocks, 6 points, 6 rebounds, and 6 assists. So that's just just to show where he was all over the court. Him and Hakeem Olajuwon, another all-time versatile player. But as I mentioned, the Jazz didn't really do a whole lot with Kirilenko as their top player. And it wasn't really until Darren Williams, Carlos Boozer, Mehmet Okur, and a few other guys kind of emerged with the Jazz that they returned to relevance. And unfortunately for Kirilenko, his struggles kind of coincided with the team becoming great. It was, right as they started getting good and right as all those other guys started getting together, Kirilenko had troubles with his shot. He had a remarkably, inefficient season. He averaged, scoring dipped, 5 points per game. He just really was struggling a lot. At one point he got some special assistance from John Hornacek and got his, shot back, later in his career, but the bloom was kind of off the rose at that point. Only a few years into his NBA career, things kind of got awry in the 2011 lockout. He returned to Russia to play with his old Moscow team, and although the lockout had been resolved, he decided to stay there instead of returning to the NBA. He then signed on with the Timberwolves and the Nets. And then finally he was traded in 2014 to the 76ers. 76ers suspended him without pay in January 2015 after he failed to report after the trade. And then on February 21st, he was waived by the Sixers because he never played a game for them and never reported. So he then went on to play for the CSKA Moscow team, yeah.
I think it's Siska, isn't it?
Siska, I don't know. I never knew if you were actually supposed to pronounce it that way or just say it.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, I unfortunately do not know of much.
Yeah, we're showing our ignorance of European basketball right now. But
I apologize. We should do.
Yes.
That's our next summer series. We do all European basketball.
There you go. Yes.
But he retired for good in 2015, and he is now the head of the Russian Basketball Federation. So good for him. But as far as his career, it's really interesting the path that he went on. I mean, it was just an uneven career, really great peaks, but far too many valleys for him to be kind of a no doubt Hall of Famer or an all time great. Though I wonder if you add in, because the Hall of Fame does add in, play elsewhere. I mean, he's an all-time great Russian player and an all-time great EuroLeague player. So he might make the Hall of Fame or the Basketball Hall of Fame off those merits, in addition to his NBA game, but we'll kind of see how that works. His 1,461 career blocks ranks him 5th among players all time, at 6'11" or 6'9" or shorter, rather. More impressive, he did it in only 797 games. Those above him, which are Josh Smith, who did it in 891 games, Elvin Hayes, 1,303, Elton Brand, 1,058, and then Ben Wallace, 1,088. So Kirilenko, I mean, the amount of blocks he got in just, a little under 800 games are just an impressive number. But it's just, he had a really weird career. He had an inexplicable drop on that 2006-2007 season. It really did him in, and he never really fully recovered. And it didn't help that, the Jazz success sort of coincided with his slump season. And then, finally he stops really producing, but the rest of the team produces and they have, a great run. They make it pretty far in the playoffs and they have a really good, few year run as well. And he just never really contributed to those teams on a huge level. So it's just an interesting career that he went on. I mean, just an awesome all-time player for the first few years, and then just kind of inexplicably dropped and never really got it back.
I mean, I think a lot of that was the issue just with when Boozer came in, the fit was just not good.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, he was really more of a power forward, and if you were playing today, I think they would have put him at power forward, but that was not, the thinking of the time. It was more of a conventional thing, and he just struggled, being the at small forward. He wasn't really much of a shooter, but he kind of could do everything else, and it was just kind of a struggle to fit kind of around him. And I'm sure there were kind of other issues as well, but I think maybe if Boozer hadn't come in, and I think it could have been different. Now, would it have been like outstanding? I don't know, but I mean, he was pretty good that year in Minnesota right near the end, and then when he went with the Nets, just all fell apart. His body and injuries and stuff. So, he did show flashes here and there, but it was, you're right, it was not the same after, those 2 or 3 really strong years in Utah before, they kind of built that team around him. But
the Boozer thing is that's a really good observation there, because they made him a spot up shooter and kind of a corner guy, because it was like, well, they had Okur and they had Boozer, and it was like, well, okay, Kirilenko can do it all, so he put him at small forward, and it just never really worked at small forward. He had trouble guarding guys, because that's where a lot of his value was too, and just him being a great defensive player and a power forward. He had the athleticism to really disrupt a lot of great power forwards, but he still had the strength and the blocking ability to, guys that were bigger than him or stronger than him, he would still be able to get up there for blocks and really just completely controlled the game from the power forward standpoint. But yeah, as you said, you bring in Okur and you bring in Boozer, and the fit just never really worked, and he just never seemed to find his footing. And what didn't help either is, right when, he started struggling and they started getting good, you heard his name in trade rumors all the time of, are they going to, and I'm sure that weighs on guys. I mean, especially, a guy who had success and had, personal success, to know that you're not contributing as much and your team kind of wants to trade you, and the team around you is doing well, even though you're doing poor, I'm sure it does weigh on you a lot. But like you said, got it going with the Timberwolves, but then the Nets happened, and then, the lockout, and it just never really got it back together. And as you said, he went back to Moscow and played in the EuroLeague and had a few good years as well. So he still had it in him. It just seemed like the NBA thing was just, I for whatever reason, just didn't quite work out.
Yeah. So on the other side of the coin, we're looking at players who had, rough starts to their career, among the worst box score plus minus for guys at age 22 or younger. So I did a couple of play index searches on Basketball Reference that were interesting. The first one is they negative 4.5 box score plus minus or worse at age 22 with at least 1,000 minutes. So there's a list of 27 guys in this list. I'm obviously not going to go through all of them. Marcus Pfizer, for reference, is the worst at negative 7.2 for the Bulls in 2001.
I loved Marcus Pfizer then. I thought he was really good, though, because he was strong and he scored a lot.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, he shot a lot, too, and he didn't go in all the time when he did. Like, damn it. That's a really bad season.
Yeah. And a lot of these guys obviously didn't play real long because they may not have been realized they were not that good, but they definitely weren't good. But Jakar Sampson is the most recent player to do it. He did it last year for the 76ers. But notable players on this list who actually ended up having pretty good careers. We'll talk about a few of them just very briefly. First, Mahmud Abdul Rauf, of course, played for the Nuggets for most of his career. The former Chris Jackson, the great, a couple years ago, there was some comparisons made to Steph Curry, at least in terms of style of play and, shooting off the dribble, that kind of thing. And his worst season, he had a negative 5.2 box score plus minus. In his career, not as bad, negative 2.2. Averaged 14 points per game, 3.5 assists per game, and 15.5 PER. So, not a kind of, I would say it's kind of an average career for the most part. So it was not a. Obviously ended up having a solid career. Most notably, of course, had the controversy where he did not wish to stand for the national anthem. They eventually kind of came to a compromise, but he got a lot of grief for that. Imagine that happening in today's society.
Thank God we've moved on and evolved and let this country is all about freedom, and finally now we let people express their freedom however they like. So thank God that we've gotten over that. So next guy on this list, BJ Armstrong. Career box plus minus negative 1.6. Got his career together. 1994 All-Star. 9.8 points per game, 3.3 assists per game, 14.5 PR. Obviously, getting together with that Bulls team and becoming a great. But to his credit, though, I mean, it wasn't just Michael, and he was a big part of that team. With Michael and with Scotty and with those guys, because he worked in the triangle quite well. He was just a perfect player for Phil Jackson to sort of mold into the perfect triangle, point guard or whatever. And to his credit, he really owned it and got his career on track after that. Of course, leaving the Bulls, then he kind of bounced around a bunch and probably didn't, find the success that he had with the Bulls, but still a pretty decent career, I'd say, for BJ Armstrong, getting it together, after a rough start. He currently now, if people aren't aware, he serves as a player agent for Derrick Rose, Draymond Green, Bismack Biyombo, Dantas Montiunas, JaVale McGee, and Denzel Valentine. So he's currently a player agent there. Did some front office work with the Bulls as well, was a scout, and was about to succeed, or thought he was going to succeed, Jerry Krause as Bulls GM, and they actually went with John Paxson, which kind of segues into the next guy.
Yes, his brother Jim Paxson, who has a career box score plus minus of negative 0.3. So one of the two on this list who are close to positive for their career. He's actually a two-time All-Star and a one-time All-NBA second team player. So he had an excellent season that year, 19.5 PR, 21.3 points per game. So probably the best season of anybody on this list. And was a very good player for Portland for a few years, and then toward the end of his career in Boston with the late 80s Celtics. So average for his career, 14.3 points per game, 20 rebounds per game, 2.9 assists per game, and 16.1 PR was a kind of went between point guard and shooting guard for his career. So sort of one of those odd like one-time All-NBA appearance lists, kind of like, oh, Jim Paxson, like I never, when digging into those, All-NBA teams and looking at guys who just kind of stood out as being like weird, he was definitely up there for me as far as like what's he doing there.
He's been a weird. We've had the month that we should have a Jim Paxson month. This is like the honorary like this in multiple episodes where we've been like, Jim Paxson's better than we thought. So that's
there you go.
Impressive. So go ahead.
Yeah. And then we have Allan Houston, of course. Yeah.
I was surprised to see him on this list in general because I always sort of assumed that Allan Houston kind of got going. I mean, we know him, as obviously started his career in Detroit, moved on to the Knicks where, there were some struggles with the Knicks, but I always thought his, Detroit tenure was pretty solid. I remember him coming into the league and being pretty good, but he had a pretty rough patch to start his career. Ended up solid though, of course, career box plus minus of negative 0.6, two-time All-Star, 17.3 points per game, 2.9 rebounds per game, 2.4 assists per game throughout his career, 14.9 PR. So maybe not quite as good as maybe his reputation is or his money or his bank account says, but Allan Houston had a really solid career. He's probably noted mostly for the iffy Knicks tenure he had, and of course the Allan Houston rule, or the quote Allan Houston rule, which is funny and perfect Knicksdom. Here is, and if people don't know what that is, in the early part of the 2000s, every team had a one-time option to waive a player and not pay the luxury tax on his contract. Houston, at the time that the rule was set, he was owed nearly $40 million over the next 2 years of his contract, and it was considered such an obvious target that the option to waive that player was known as the Allan Houston rule. And of course, the Knicks decided to not release him and didn't just ignored those expectations and just kept Allan Houston.
Yeah,
so the Allan Houston rule was never used on Allan Houston. So
they didn't want him to go to another team that a rival, and thought it would be bad PR, I guess. But anyway, next, Jeff Bolon, another two-time All-Star. He was a shooting guard mostly with the Bullets and the Jazz. I always think of him for that crazy falling out of bounds, a 3-point game winner that was part of all those 80s highlight tapes. That's just like one of the greatest, most amazing, circus shots ever. If you haven't seen the videotape, you just look up Jeff Bolon game winner and you'll see it. So,
or if you owned a basketball VHS as a child, it's probably on there because I think I have 3 that I can vividly remember that is on. It's like wild and crazy. I forgot the names were all like radical 90s names and like tubular and like all those sort of things. So sure. I don't remember what they were called, but like I definitely have 3 that have this shot on it. I remember as a kid just loving it. I always do it in the backyard too. It's one of those ones that you always would watch and then try to recreate.
Right. Maybe it's not the greatest shot ever, but it's the most tubular shot ever, I think.
It was radical. Yeah. That's for sure.
Career box score plus minus negative 2.1, which is a little bit worse than I would have expected for a player, kind of for his reputation. Like I said, the stat may not capture everything. 19 points per game, 2.6 rebounds per game, 2.4 assists per game, and a 15.2 PER. So pretty good in those metrics. Pretty well-rounded kind of guy.
He was a scorer. Definitely wasn't too into the defense.
Didn't do a whole lot else.
Didn't really like the defense, but that's fine.
No,
who cares?
If
we're dropping 20 a game, who needs to play D?
You make the most tubular shot ever. You don't have to play defense.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. That's defense is so like old, and this is the 90s, man. You don't.
Yeah.
That's our parents used to play defense. We're too radical for that.
Yeah. Right. Of course, 20 years later, we're going to say that all we did was play defense. And
exactly. Right. The 90s was all about defense.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So there are a few guys on here who kind of were more okay players.
Before we move on, I forgot to mention the best part about Jeff Malone is that he was like pretty much always the second best Malone on every team he was on. So
that's true.
Which kind of sucks.
Fair point. Yes, that's true.
Like Malone, he's like, Carl, you're talking about Carl, aren't you?
Moses with the Bullets and Moses and then Carl. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but that makes a lot of sense.
Poor Jeff Malone. He's always,
poor Jeff. Yeah. Oh well.
Always had to get a shitty jersey too because it had to say J Malone on it or whatever. It's like, damn it. Nobody wants that.
At least he didn't have to have the full name on there. The full name jerseys are always the worst ones. Yeah. You know, like Marcus Johnson having to have his full name on his jersey. You know. Exactly. So. You know, as far as there's a handful of guys who developed into okay players, you know, Antonio Daniels, Kenny Gatson, Terry Catlich, Larry Drew. The only active guys on this list are Nick Young and Wayne Ellington, who, you know, not really strong careers, but they've had fairly lengthy careers since 2009 to 2010. Actually, both are having their best basketball plus minus seasons this year. So go them, you know.
People are getting very upset that you said Nick Young is not having a great career. So
it's near positive this year. He's having a nice year. Good for him. So I also filtered out guys. I went with 1,500 minutes or more and 22 and under. So this is seasons, you know, considering, you know, 19, 20, and 21, 22. There's 34 guys in this. I'm not going to mention them again, but a lot of repeats here. But some others that are notable is E. Jianlian, Kevin Willis, Michael Beasley, Darrell Griffith, Craig Hodges, Tony Roten, J.J. Hickson, Kendall Marshall, and Sebastian Telfair. Some standouts there. Now, Kevin Willis, you know, he had a long career, was an All-NBA third-team player. Darrell Griffith was a 1981 Rookie of the Year, good scorer, early three-point star. So, you know, those guys had productive careers, but no one on this list, amazingly enough, has had a positive box score plus minus for their career, not even Kevin Willis. So some active guys who are on this list, Brandon Ingram, Lila Okafor, Zach LaVine, Emmanuel Mudiay, or Tim Hardaway Jr., you know, all these guys are, you know, -4 or more box score plus minus in a season. You know, once you're on this list, it is really difficult to have a productive career because you know, most of the guys on this list, you know, some of them had, you know, solid careers, some of them, you know, were okay, but to have like a great career on being this list, it hasn't happened yet. So it's going to be interesting to see, you know, kind of what things happen for guys like that. You know, Zach LaVine was looking good before the knee injury. You know, the other guys, I think right now, for the most part, obviously they're all young, so you don't want to write them off, except for Tim Hardaway Jr. He's okay-ish kind of player. But the other guys, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with them because, the track record is not great for guys on this list.
No, and a lot of these guys, and you'll see from the list, or, you know, we mentioned a lot of them, but yeah, most of them just, you know, they're either not with that team that drafts them, you know, very long, and then they kind of bounce around. Because once that first team kind of gives up on you, a lot of times it's very hard to get going. And, you know, save for, you know, Allan Houston and a few of the other guys like BJ Armstrong or whatever that we mentioned, they were able to kind of move around a little bit and work, you know, their career through that. But yeah, a lot of the other guys just never quite got going. And, you know, once that first team gives up on you, it's really hard to kind of get your thing, you know, get your career back together and get back on that level. So yeah, it'll be very interesting to see those guys. And it's interesting. That's kind of the list of guys that I would assume, you know, would make this list as well. And yeah, it doesn't look very great for any of them. Maybe, you know, Brandon Ingram, I would maybe give a little bit too, just because he's so young. But a few of the other guys, I don't know. It's not looking great for them. But
yeah.
We'll see.
Thanks, everyone, for checking us out. You can find us at thestepback at fansided.com. You can also find us on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcast. Please leave us a rating and review. We like it. It makes us happy, and it gets people to know what we're doing. So spread the word and all that good stuff. And you can find us on Twitter and Facebook at Over and Back NBA. So give us a follow and a like or whatever you would prefer to do. So thanks for listening, and we're back again soon.